For the majority of people in the Western world, the concept of free speech is often regarded as one of our most important rights as humans. We, as humans, should have the right to articulate our opinions, criticisms, and thoughts freely without the fear of retaliation, censorship, or sanction. But often overlooked is the price that we have to pay for our free speech. What is the cost of our freedom of speech? Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. And again, as always, I am your host, Johnson Zen. And before we begin, I just want to thank you all for your reviews, comments, likes, and all of your support. And if you enjoy this podcast, please remember to rate, comment, subscribe, review, and thank you again so much. So let's get started. Freedom of speech. I think it's something we often take for granted in the Western world. I think we forget that there are still many countries and places around the world where people could be incarcerated or killed for openly speaking their minds. But before I go any further, I just want to talk about the origins of free speech. I think in many schools in the US, we've been sort of told this lie or half-truth about our freedom of speech. One of the things that we were often told in school, or at least my teachers, was that the US kind of sort of created the notion of free speech. And for a while, that's what I believed. And this is just simply not true, because the concept of free speech is as old as the concept of democracy. And again, to all of my American listeners out there, no, the US did not create democracy. We're not even a true democracy, but that's a topic for another time. And as I was saying earlier, the origins of free speech can be traced back to ancient Greece. It's believed that the idea of free speech developed around the 5th or 6th century BCE, during the time when the ancient Greeks were experimenting with democracy. The idea of free speech is over 2,500 years old, which is 10 times the age of the US. 100 years prior to American independence, Britain passed the English Bill of Rights, which basically established Britain's freedom of speech. Even after America's independence from Britain, the ratification of the Constitution was in 1788. We didn't even establish our right to free speech until the ratification of the Bill of Rights 3 years later in 1789. And 2 years prior, during the French Revolution in 1789, the French adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which means that both the British and French were guaranteed free speech before the Americans were. If we skip to 1948, following the end of the Second World War, the United Nations General Assembly passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in Article 19 of the Declaration, it states that, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media regardless of frontier, end quote. This is the first universal agreement between countries from all over the world to what human rights should be. First of all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not legally binding to any of the countries in the UN. It just simply defines the definition of universal human rights. It's sort of like a general guideline that countries in the UN should follow. And legally, the UN doesn't have the power to enforce this declaration to any of its member countries. This is the reason why you hear in the news that such and such country is in violation of UN human rights, but ultimately nothing is or could be done about it because there's not much the UN could really do about it. So, like I said before, the right of free speech in the US dates back to when the Bill of Rights were ratified in 1791. A lot has happened since the original passing of the Bill of Rights, and I think it's important to talk about what exactly free speech is, especially nowadays with all this political unrest in the country. And I want to put a big disclaimer out there that I am not a lawyer and nor am I affiliated with any political organization. I'm just going to be stating some facts as well as my own opinions on certain subjects. So it's up to you to really believe what I'm saying. I'll make it clear to what is fact and what is my opinion. And for the most part, if I make a reference in any way to the first person, like if I say I, me, my, you can be sure that's my opinion. Other than that, everything else you can take as fact. And if you don't believe in facts, then I'm really sorry. I can't help you. You might be the problem with this country if you don't believe in facts. And also, I'm sorry if you're listening to this and you're not from the US. Hopefully, some things I'll be talking about will be applicable to you. If not, just let me know what the differences are in your country. And I think it'll be fun and interesting to kind of know what our differences are in how we view free speech. So now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at free speech in the US. The first and best place to start is to look at the actual Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights. So in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, it reads, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, end quote. Now that's a mouthful. I'm sure many of my American listeners already know the 5 rights the First Amendment guarantees. Obviously, for today, we're going to focus on the second of those rights, which is our right of free speech. So I think there's a general misconception about what free speech means. The Constitution guarantees that Congress or government should not and cannot make any laws that prohibit freedom of speech. This means that only the government is prohibited from making laws or rules that limit your free speech. Private corporations like Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're not prohibited from doing so. That means if Facebook doesn't like something you posted, they're well within their right to censor you or even terminate your account. It's all in the terms of service you agreed to before you created your account. And I know you are all responsible, and I know that you've all read those terms of service before you agree to create that account. Of course you all did, right? Because you're all responsible people. And I think this is where the biggest misconception about free speech lies. I think that people are ignorant to the fact that our free speech only applies to when it comes to the government. I've seen so many people complain on Facebook and Twitter that their free speech is being violated by these companies, when in fact, their free speech isn't guaranteed by these companies. I also find it really funny how some people complain about Facebook violating their free speech and they're posting this on Facebook. Talk about irony. Well, nobody really knows what irony is. But hopefully this kind of clears it up with people. Private companies don't have to guarantee your right of free speech, at least just in the US. Now, let's talk about some of the limits of free speech. Are you allowed to say anything you want? Yes and no. Free speech doesn't mean you have the right to say anything you want. There are several restrictions when it comes to free speech. Whether or not you agree with these restrictions are a matter of your own personal opinion, but know that these restrictions have developed over time with court cases and Supreme Court rulings. I'm going to go over a few of the exceptions to our free speech. The first exception to free speech is incitement. You are not allowed to incite or advocate violence against any person or group of people. This means you're not allowed to threaten to kill someone, whether it means you personally threatening to kill someone or you telling someone else to kill someone. You can't say, I'm going to kill Bob, or you can't ask someone, hey, can you kill Bob for me? That's not protected under free speech because you are threatening someone's life. This also means you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because it could cause mass panic, which will endanger the lives of people in that theater. I think this one's pretty obvious, and I think most people will agree with this restriction since it's there to protect people. The second exception to free speech is false statements. So this mainly applies to in the court. So if you're standing trial and the judge or prosecutor or whoever is asking you a question related to the trial, you have to tell the truth. You're not allowed to lie in court, and if you do, you'll have committed a felony. Again, I think most people would agree with this. If you're in court, you should be restricted against telling false statements. Now, where the big debate is the restrictions of false statements outside of court. So in the US, we do have libel laws, which mean that you are not allowed to make false statements about a person intentionally to defame or damage their reputation. This is an extremely complicated issue here in the US. I know in the UK, libel laws are much stricter, but in the US, even though there are libel laws, they're just filled with legal gray areas and loopholes. And what I mean by this is, I can't say, for example, Steve Jobs is a cannibalistic pedophile without any proof. But one way I could get around this is if instead of stating this as a fact, I state this as an opinion. I'm allowed to say, I think that Steve Jobs is a cannibalistic pedophile. This is protected under free speech. And yes, it's very complicated, and that's why in the US, it's extremely difficult to sue anyone for libel. This is why Rush Limbaugh can say that he believes that President Obama is a Kenyan Muslim trying to put the US under Sharia law without any consequences at all. Because they're allowed to do that because that's all opinion. And honestly, I think it's a little bit too much, and I do wish we had some stricter libel laws similar to the UK, but that's just me, and you don't have to agree with my opinion. And also, for your information, I don't think Steve Jobs is a cannibal or a pedophile, but who knows? So now the third exception to free speech is obscenity. This one's also in a kind of weird gray area. And for this, we need to look at something called the Miller test, which is taken from the court case Miller versus California. The details of the case aren't that important, but what it does establish is a guideline for when speech is protected when it comes to obscenity. According to the Miller test, speech is unprotected if, quote, the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the subject or work in question, taken as a whole, appears to the prurient interest and depicts or describes in a patently offensive way contemporary community standards, sexual conduct defined by the applicable law. The work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Oh boy, where do I begin with this? The biggest problem with the Miller test is basing obscenity on, quote, community standards. What the heck are community standards? From what I can find, they're basically considered what the average person finds offensive. This is so problematic for many reasons. The main reason is that what the average person finds offensive varies from state to state, and even in the same state, from city to city. That means if you talk about a sensitive subject like your sex life out in public in Los Angeles, you'll probably be fine, but if you do the same thing in a more conservative part of the country, let's say some small town in Mormon, Utah, your speech may not be protected. Basically, this exception is really strange. So, all I can really say about this is just be conscientious of what you say in public places, especially if you're in a more conservative part of the country. And just a rule of thumb, I think we can all agree that you should always be careful with what you say around children. The last exception to free speech is speech owned by others. All this is basically protection of intellectual property. So things like copyrights, trademarks, they all fall under this category. And for the most part, I agree with this exception. I believe in the protection of intellectual property, and I believe that you have the right to protect your own creation from others. I say this, though I don't quite agree with all the stipulations of the US copyright rules. I don't think it's fair that certain companies, Disney, get to keep their copyrights for so long. Anyways, that's neither here nor there, so that's it for our exceptions of free speech, at least in the US. Except I lied. As always, there's one exception I didn't mention, which is an entirely different gray area, and that is hate speech. Historically, so the Supreme Court has ruled that although they don't like hate speech, as long as hate speech does not incite violence, it's protected under the First Amendment. So this means that white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, they're free to say whatever racist thing they want to say as long as they're not threatening to kill anyone. They're free to say whatever they want. I know that this may come as no surprise to many of you who've probably wondered why no one's been able to sue the KKK for their hate speech against the black community. But aside from racial hate speech, other forms of hate speech like homophobic, Islamophobic, misogynistic hate speech, it's all protected under the First Amendment. And as much as I don't like their bigotry being protected under the First Amendment, I also side with the courts on this. And I know a lot of people will probably disagree with this, but hear me out. I think that part of the price we have to pay for our freedom of speech is that even the most disgusting bigots in this country have the right to express their bigotry. I'm sorry to all those people who are probably going to be upset by this, but please understand that the issue is bigger than the bigots. Part of the beauty of our freedom of speech is the ability and freedom to freely express our thoughts. We can't set a precedent where we get to pick and choose and decide which thoughts we get to censor. We can't tell people who or what they can or can't like or dislike. It's our right to be able to express ourselves freely, whether you agree with that person or not. That same right the KKK has to be openly racist is also the same right that Martin Luther King had when he made his famous speech. I'm sorry if you want there to be a law against hate speech. There's really just no way for that to happen without massive consequences, which is where I want to end. Our freedom of speech is our right. It is our right to be able to freely speak our minds. But free speech doesn't mean you're free from the consequences of your speech. Again, let me reiterate. The First Amendment protects your speech from the government, but it doesn't protect you from the consequences of your speech. If you're a racist bigot, you can say the most racist comments to someone in a bus or park or wherever. You're free to do so, but what happens afterwards, it's all on you. I can't tell you how many stories of people I've seen that have either lost their jobs, been kicked out of school after making a racist post on social media. Though I don't agree that people should or legally could be fired for saying something racist outside of their job, I'm not going to vouch for them to get their jobs back. And to the people who complain about getting, quote, attacked while they're making a racist or bigoted comment, just know that your hate speech goes both ways. people will see your hate speech and raise you their freedom to let you know what kind of person you truly are. And to me, that is the price we pay for our free speech. And with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your Moment of Zen. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya.